central London is, not as good as it should be. Rob Braun, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
Hey, thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, I'm great, thank you. How are you?
I am very good. I think you're in the UK as well, and we're currently experiencing a lovely period of sunny weather, which is a bit of a novelty, I'm sure you would agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Also in the UK, just outside London, and yes, it's been great having some sunshine for a change.
I love the small talk weather chat. That's so British of us. So
Mm.
we first
Got to
met.
got to get it out of the way before we start anything serious.
Absolutely. So we first met
Mm.
pre-COVID at a London Space networking event. Um, I've had Noosh on the podcast before. She's one of the organisers of the London Space Network. And it's a great event. I always go to those sorts of events with a slight dose of imposter syndrome because I always meet interesting and very clever people like yourself, scientists, engineers with crazy ideas in the space sector. And I remember chatting to you about your business, and I'd only had about half a beer, but I couldn't really follow what you do. Um, but I've just been on your website again, and I just remember you telling me 2 years ago what space braids do. Um, so yeah, why don't you tell me what you do? Tell me about space braid.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Well, I do remember that conversation. It was quite a while ago, and it was very early days for us. What we do at Braided Communications is that we actually do two things. We have a product now for use on Earth, which I can talk about in a bit, but the space side of it is where we started. And we set about solving a problem which actually most people thought was impossible to solve. We're working for sort of future deep space missions. So obviously, no one's been back to the moon for a long time, but people are planning to go to the moon in the next couple of years or so. And then there are plans to go from the moon onwards to Mars. Lots of challenges when you go into deep space. You know, you've got to have a big rocket, you've got to know where you're going, you've got to be able to take enough water with you, all those kinds of things. You've also got to be able to communicate back to Earth. And a challenge that people rarely think about is that as you get further and further from Earth, you're going to have a delay on communications. It's going to take literally physically a long time for the signal, which might be carried by a laser or radio waves, to travel from the ship back to Earth. So if you were on Mars now and I was on Earth and we were trying to do this podcast, everything you say would take somewhere between 3 and 20 minutes to reach me, depending on where the planets are. And my replies would take just the same amount of time to get back to you. So you can't have a normal conversation. And that's a basic fact of physics. It isn't changing. It's because the speed of light is fixed but not infinite. So it's always been known that this is going to be a problem, but everyone's assumed that because the speed of light isn't changing, you can't do anything about it. What we've done is we've developed a technique that allows us to interleave different threads or braids of communication so that to an astronaut on a ship going to Mars, or indeed on the surface of Mars, it would feel to him or her as if they were in a normal conversation, even when they're not. So that's what we do. When I first met you, that was an idea that we had. It's now been built and we've been testing it.
So I feel exactly the same as when you told me last time because conceptually I can't understand how it works. So is it a case of you're both having a delayed conversation and what you're saying is delayed and synced up, so it seems like you're speaking at the same time?
Pretty much. So if I try and explain how it works in as simple terms as I can, it's going to be a challenge on audio only because it is a visual tool. So the first thing to say is if you're going to have a braided session, that it's a typed communication. So it's not audio, it's typed. And if you're on Mars, I'm on Earth, we're having this session, and we've pre-agreed the time for the session. And when we log in to our system, our braided system, each of us can see effectively a window in front of us or a braid, but each of us is looking at a different braid. So I would be perhaps typing in one braid, and because I'm on Earth, I'm typing about, I don't know, the weather as we started talking at the beginning. You're on Mars, There isn't much weather on Mars. There's some, not much. You're typing about the farm that you're running. So each of us is typing about a different subject. After a certain period of time, a couple of minutes, depending on how we've configured it, we can change that. The window that you're typing in begins its journey to me, and the window I'm typing in begins its journey to you. And these windows are presented on a rotating carousel. So each of us is looking at a rotating carousel in front of us. And your second braid appears in front of you. My second braid appears in front of me. But those are different braids. I might be typing then about the latest update on COVID, and you might be typing about an experiment that you're running on Mars. But after a while, once you've configured it correctly, as the carousel rotates, each time it rotates, it brings to me fresh content from you. And at the same time, it brings to you fresh content from me. So each of us is in a separate series of exchanges that feel natural and real time. And we're actually in the same conversation. And psychologically, that's very important. We're in the same carousel. We're just on opposite sides. But what we have is the feeling of a natural flowing exchange of information. We're just actually in different places within it, but that doesn't become apparent to you. You never feel like that.
That's very well explained. So how did this idea come about? Because I guess when you're thinking about deep space communication, it's obviously a hugely important issue. You know, communication is, I'd probably say, one of the most important things when you're considering going to another planet for a year, 2 years. Were you just thinking, oh, I wonder if we can solve that problem? Or did your previous experience were you working on something that you saw an overlap into space braiding?
So that's a great question, Ben. So the original idea actually came from my co-founder, Drew Smith-Simmons. So he and I are co-founders in Braided Communications. My background, I'm actually an astrophysicist by training, and I spent a long time in telecoms and in communications. And then I moved into something called digital health, where I was working on a number of physical and mental health care services. I met my co-founder, Drew, when we were working at the same company doing online cognitive behavioral therapy. So he is a psychologist. And he had the idea at first because he's very interested in space and the whole industry. And he was basically just thinking about humans planning to go to Mars and hearing about the work that was going on in NASA and other places. And he began to wonder, with his psychological background, how they had solved this problem. Because what he knew is if you take 6, 7 people, put them in a small tin can and blast them to Mars, if they are unable to remain emotionally connected to their loved ones on Earth, then they will become psychologically unwell, and they will then become physiologically unwell, and then they will stop performing as a crew. They won't work well, and the mission will be at risk. So he assumed in his head, well, these clever people in the various space agencies, they can't possibly be considering sending people to Mars without having solved this problem. But he couldn't think about how you would solve it because he knew the speed of light was a limiter. So he just went to do some research, and because NASA, the European Space Agency, they're all publicly funded, you can find out quite a lot. And what he found was this problem was understood to a degree, certainly the operational part of it. There wasn't much about the psychology. It was understood to a degree, but it was just assumed that it could not be solved because the speed of light cannot be changed. So there was an assumption that you would just recruit a crew who were all less susceptible to emotional isolation. And there are people who are at different levels of a spectrum there. So there are people who are less susceptible to emotional isolation, but they don't tend to form good bonds with their fellow crewmates. So you've got to kind of catch 22. If you want a group of people who are going to be good crewmates, they need to be more emotionally aware, if you like. If you want a group of people who are going to be able to survive being sent to Mars without being able to talk to their mum or their sister or their husband or whatever it might be, then you need people at the other end. So he knew there was a problem. He basically knew from a psychological point of view that if there wasn't a solution to this, that long term, we wouldn't be able to go to Mars very effectively. And so he began to think about it. Now, if I'd thought about that problem, being an astrophysicist and techie, I'd have just thought, well, can't be solved because the speed of light isn't changing. One of the other things he knew was he knew about the ability for people to communicate in a very plastic manner. We're all very adaptable in our communication. So he began to think about the way that you could structure communication in this different way. And he kind of, when he and I first talked about it, he had the idea of braiding, but he didn't have the concept of the carousel that allows us to actually effectively present it to people. So when he and I started working together, we took his original innovation and idea of structuring communication in multiple threads, and were able to make it into something that could actually be presented to the space agencies as a tool that they could then use and test. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the benefits of, from a mental health side, of having sort of instant communications, and I guess there's operational benefits as well if you can speak directly from Earth real time, or as closer to real time. Because that's one of the vast differences between low Earth orbit and the International Space Station, is that, you know, if there's a problem on board, you've got thousands of people on Earth you can speak to instantaneously. How far could your solution work? Are you thinking this is just a solution for Mars, or could space braiding work as humanity eventually travels further out into the solar system?
So that's a great question, Ben. There's probably sort of several levels in there. So yeah, braiding helps psychologically, we believe, and operationally. We've started to do some research projects working with ESA, the UK Space Agency, and NASA, and begun to look at these things and get data as to whether it does help or not. And early data seems to be positive. So it will help operationally. It will help, we believe, psychologically, if you like, emotionally, the mental health aspect. It's not in any way more real time than the physical distance. It just feels different. So it means that if you're doing an operational conversation between a ship and mission control, the astronauts don't need to have a lot of their cognitive effort spent on trying to work out which question has just been answered. It's all handled for them, and emotionally they feel like they're in the same conversation. That's it's not any more real time. That's just a better way of communicating in some aspects. And then what we have tested it with, because of course, you know, it's it's not very easy, but it's possible to model how far away Mars is. At its very furthest, so when Earth is on one side of the sun and Mars is on the other side of the sun, you've got a time delay of about 22 minutes one way. When they're as close as possible on the same side of the sun, it's just over 3 minutes. So we have tested braiding between ourselves and a few close contacts at all of those levels. And we've compared it with the alternative, which is effectively kind of time delayed messaging, if you like. And in all cases, it works, and it works well. You know, we need to do a lot more research as to how that works as latencies vary. So we believe braiding will be able to be a key part of the communications infrastructure supporting future missions, even when there's people living on Mars for a semi-permanent basis and they're on the far side of the sun, so 22 light minutes away. Going much further than that into the solar system, it will become much more challenging to communicate back to Earth. But what becomes quite interesting then is actually, you know, at some point people will go to, I hope people will go to Mars in my lifetime. I think I'm a lot older than you, Ben, so I hope so. I'd be very surprised if any human beings start to get any further. The next kind of obvious target would be some of the asteroids or some of the moons of Jupiter. They're so much further away. That's simply not going to happen in my lifetime. So I'm hoping that I can help humans get to Mars. When they get further than that, they may well be leaving from Mars. And by that point, the communication for those people might be back to Mars or something else. So actually, over time, there could be a kind of a whole kind of, you know, cobweb, if you like, of communication channels across different parts of the solar system. And hopefully braiding will be able to be part of some of those. But for now, I'm focusing on the moon and Mars.
There will definitely be someone on Mars in our lifetimes. I think within 10 years, I think within the decade, we're going to see the first human on Mars. How is the UK sort of positioning itself to be one of the leaders in deep space communication? Because you wouldn't think that it's naturally positioned to do so. You know, you'd assume a country like Australia, where you can build a huge satellite. But I guess what your space braiding is proposing is sort of slightly different. So do you think the fact that this is a UK business it offers a solution that it doesn't really matter, how it's deployed. It's just something that you can install on spacecraft and then have the systems back on Earth and Mars. So yeah, sorry, there's a lot of questions in there, but yeah, what's it like as a sort of UK company, and physically, what is the process of
Yeah.
installing it and getting it live?
So I'll take the second question first, because that's the simple and easy one. So it's a software service, right? So we don't need to launch any hardware to do this, which is great, because launching hardware becomes expensive and complex, etc. So at the moment, all of our tests and our demonstrations have been on Earth. So there is no latency in communication on Earth. So we've been creating the latency in our software service to simulate and to be able to understand how people behave. But when it starts to be used in space, there's no weight associated with it. It's just software. So the
Wow.
person on the ship and the person on the ground are just communicating in a browser, just as you and I are now, albeit they're doing it typed. So that's the easy part. The other part was the question about the UK, and that's really interesting. So the UK has got a great heritage in communications, a fantastic heritage in communications. Of course, there's been a lot of work in the UK on communication satellites and huge level of expertise in that area. Also, a great deal of communications expertise over the years in terrestrial telecoms. I personally spent most of my career doing that, so I'm pretty aware of that. And we've had a lot of support recently, actually, from the UK Space Agency. So, to the best of our knowledge, we are the first project supported by the UK Space Agency that has specific aims for deep space communication. But we're not the first for communication in space. There's a lot of work there. So it's a huge area of expertise for the UK. The UK recently published its UK, I can't remember what it's called actually, but basically the UK space strategy. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of that. And what we do fits very, very well within that. It's an area which really plays the UK strengths. It's also interesting, an area where no one else globally is doing much on this. So I talked earlier about the challenges you've got going into deep space of rockets and water and everything, and you have that. And actually, there are three key challenges within that for health in space, crewed health in deep space. One of them is radiation, because you're going to be exposed to a lot of radiation. One is microgravity, you're in a different gravity field. And the other one is isolation, within which communication delays is a key part. The radiation and microgravity are two where there's been a lot of research, and it's quite intuitive to people. They see films of people floating around, there's going to be an effect for that. But the issue of latency and high latency is not obvious until you really think deeply about it. So actually, it's an area where there's an opportunity to do a lot of future research and really grab a leadership position there. And we're really hopeful that the UK will do that, with us being part of it, of course.
Fantastic. Yeah, you definitely think of the UK as being a sort of space services company, as opposed to a sort of hardware a launch provider. I know that's obviously changing. With things like radiation, how does that affect space braiding? So if Mars is the other side of the sun, does that change the effectiveness? Or is there certain times where you're going to get a blackout period where space braiding wouldn't work?
So that's the question of the communications is really important. Actually, we when we run braiding have some significant advantages over other communications. So yeah, if the sun is in between us and Mars, you can't send a direct signal. You're going to have to bounce off a satellite somewhere, and that's going to mean that the route is even longer and perhaps more unstable. And inevitably, as you get into deep space, there's going to be a system. There's going to be a series of outages and glitches, and a whole load of issues could impact on the communication, the literal transfer of the radio waves from one place to another, which carries the information. With space braiding, because of the way it's configured, it's actually very tolerant to outages. Because if you are looking at a braiding panel and I'm looking at a different one and the carousel is rotating between us, if the information that's being sent is interrupted in any way, as long as there's an opportunity to send that same information within the time period of the rotation of the carousel, it doesn't affect your interpretation of that communication. And that could be really helpful for use in low Earth orbit on the ISS, and also on the moon when we go back to the moon through Artemis. Because even though the latency at the ISS is effectively zero, and the latency at the moon is just over a second, it doesn't really prevent you having an audio conversation. If I'm talking to you and I'm using protocol saying over afterwards, and I'm waiting a couple of seconds for your reply, if there's an interruption in the communication that means your reply doesn't reach me and I have to ask you again, then you've got a disruption. With braiding, that wouldn't affect us. We would be able to keep communicating despite it. So for some applications, even closer, we suspect that the braiding methodology will allow a more effective end-to-end communication despite underlying challenges and outages on the communication leg.
That's brilliant. It seems like such a great solution. You mentioned you're engaging with NASA, ESA, and the UK Space Agency. What's your aspirations for a test in space?
We are engaging with all three of those. We've had support from all of those in terms of them all funding research projects to study braiding in different scenarios and with different particular use cases. We do have some very good connections into some of the team at NASA who are considering, very early days, but considering using us as a sort of technical demonstrator. There's lots of work to do there. So we do want to be shown to be able to be used as a technical demonstrator on the ISS and hopefully as part of Artemis. But actually, because, as I said earlier on, because we're just a software solution, we don't need to worry about whether we're going to fit into the weight profile of future missions or anything like that. So our focus is still at this stage on showing the value of this in terms of improving operational effectiveness and improving the psychological opportunities for crew to communicate. So that's the main focus, and it's going to remain that on the space side. The terrestrial side is entirely different, as I said.
Well, let's talk about the terrestrial side, because I know you sort of adapted the technology to create braided meetings. So what is braided meetings, and how does that differ from Riverside that we're using today?
So yes, we did. So we built braided meetings as well, which is the same methodology but deployed on Earth. So the way I described braiding earlier with a carousel, and I talked about multiple braids, and you and I you were on Mars. I think you had the fun gig. I was still stuck on Earth. And so the braids that we weren't actively typing in were making the journey across the void so we wouldn't be exposed to the latency. On Earth, where there isn't any latency, that same carousel, we could have one person per panel at the same time. So a braided meeting is a carousel that rotates virtually between a group of people. Each person is typing, and if you think about, say, four of us, say there was you and me and two other people having a conversation, there'd be a carousel with four panels rotating between us, and four topics would be rotating, and each of us would get a turn to give our thoughts on a particular topic. So it's just a different way of having a meeting. And at first thought, you would think, well, why would I want to do that? And what's emerging is two really strong reasons why you might want to do that. The first one, and the one that actually Drew and I, as founders of the business, really understood, and why we first started to build it, is to allow teams of introverts and extroverts to work together more effectively. So if you're in a meeting, you always have a mix of introverts and extroverts because everyone's different, right? And in general, huge generalization, but in general, extroverts have this habit to do what's described as talk to think. So if there's a quiet patch, they'll feel uncomfortable, they'll start talking and they're thinking and they're coming up with kind of an idea that's only half formed as it sort of, falls out of their mouth, if you like. An introverted person, in contrast, will be thinking to talk. He or she will be, they won't want to grab the mic in the way the extrovert does, but they'll have some very strong views or some great ideas, and they'll be going, I've got this idea, I'm going to say something, just about to say it, and then the extrovert pipes up, and then they don't say it. So you have this challenge with all meetings where you don't get the best out of everybody. In simplistic terms, the output of many meetings is the kind of half thought through utterances of the extroverts, where the well thought through utterances of the introverts are never heard. So we thought that using braided meetings in some of those situations, you could actually get more out of your team by allowing everyone to contribute equally. And that's where we start. And this is very new. The braided meetings thing only went live a couple of weeks ago. We're also starting to now get feedback from people we're talking to that it could be really helpful for neurodiverse people. So there are people, autism in particular is one that's getting a lot of press at the moment. And autistic people do struggle to integrate properly into companies and to contribute properly in meetings because the way they like to communicate is different. And it seems as if braided meetings could be a tool that will allow some people who have got neurodiversity opportunities in their teams to support those teams better. So it could be that an autistic team member might prefer that some team meetings are held on braided meetings. So that's where we've gone with that. So it's the same methodology, but without the latency, you can use different. You can address different challenges, and we think / hope we're building something that helps neurodiversity in business.
That's great. It sounds like a really smart application of your idea. Because I'm just thinking about sometimes when you're on a Zoom with 20, 30 people, it's difficult to put your hand up to contribute, or you might get missed because you can only see certain people on the screen at any one time. And sometimes in meetings, for a lot of people, you kind of have an idea about something that you talked about 5 minutes ago, but because you're not in the same room as them, there's sort of a different. It feels a bit awkward to kind of say, "Oh, can we just go back and, I've got a point to make." So that's a very interesting angle. Just talking about yourself and Drew, your business partner, you seem like quite a well operated team with sort of clear roles and responsibilities. How have you found that? Because I speak to a lot of space entrepreneurs, for want of a better term. Some are solo, some have co-founders. How have you found sort of working with a sort of business partner? And what would you recommend to people looking to start a business and they're thinking, do I need a co-founder? Can I do this alone? What's your thoughts on that?
So yeah, Drew and I have known each other for quite a while before we started to work on braided meetings together. And I think the best thing about Drew and I, which is it's a simplification if you like, but we're very different people. So I'm an astrophysicist by academic training, albeit only first degree, but I've always been passionate about physics, always been numerate and a scientist. I've worked a lot in comms, etc. Drew's a very different background, psychologist, moving into literally delivering mental health care. Doesn't have the science background, but absolutely has. Doesn't have the physics background, but has the psychology background. And we found that has been really valuable. I mentioned earlier on that we're very different other ways as well. So I'm quite an extrovert person. Drew's quite introvert. That's helped us a lot as we've developed braided meetings. It also helps us a lot as we've been able to think through challenges. So sometimes I've become a little bit frustrated about the way he thinks, and I know that sometimes he's become frustrated about the way I think. But by allowing each of us to sort of have the space to think, we've generally come up with better ways forward for the business. And because we have such different skill sets, we don't actually have roles in the business. We're just both the co-founders of the business. But it works because it's pretty clear when something comes in, pretty much whether I'm going to do it or he's going to do it or we're both going to do it. So that's, I suppose you could argue that's fortunate in that the way we are. But I think so the original idea was Drew's. And before he asked me to join him as co-founder of a business to exploit the idea, he had to make sure he knew that we'd be a great team together, and that's been the case. What I would say is you asked about other people. I think a couple of thoughts on that, and these kinds of points are always very hard because they vary so much with whoever it does depend a lot on who you're talking to and what the idea is. So the idea of braiding And the problem it solves is really clear and easy to understand and specific, etc. So for space braiding, that's great, and we've managed to then evolve that to something similar for braided meetings. I think that was an important part of any business you're setting up. If you've got an idea, and if the idea does make sense, you're definitely then onto something. And it always helps to have more than one person to be able to, it's easy to, what's that phrase they use in America, drink your own Kool-Aid or whatever. So, one person could easily convince him or herself that what they've got is a good idea when it's not. And we've had a few things like that between Drew and I, where one of us has said, "Why don't we do X?" The other one has said, "I'm not sure. Let me think about it." And then something's nagging away. But actually, that's not a good idea because. And I think that's always helpful. So, in my past, I have run my own business as a one person business. It worked pretty well, but it would have been better if there had been two of us. So if there is an opportunity to work with someone else, I think in general, that's always more powerful. Sorry, that was a long and rambling answer, Ben. Sorry about that.
No, that was great advice. And having run my own businesses and worked with co-founders, I agree with you. I like something you said about giving each other space to think. I think that could be a great tagline for Braided Communication. Just before we go, what is where does the name Space Braiding come from? Is it from sort of braiding hair, that kind of interlinking locks of hair, or where did the term come from?
So, yeah, it's just the same root, if you like. That's where braiding hair comes from. Braiding, as I understand it, kind of, it basically means intertwined together. Interesting enough, actually, when Drew and I first talked about this is a very long story I won't go into now, but he and I were in Stornoway on the Western Isles in Scotland doing some work up there. It's pretty remote, and there is actually a hotel up there which had a carpet which had threads and braids intertwined, which I still have a photograph of, and that's where the sort of first thought began to emerge. And so, yeah, it definitely comes from that. So the multiple threads that intertwine as they make their way through space is where the name comes from.
Rob, it's been great to chat. I think space braiding is a fantastic idea, and I think it will definitely be a key part of making human life multiplanetary. And I wish you all the luck in the world with getting it off Earth and getting it tested. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Ben.